In the sweltering summer dawn of June 24, 1944, a petty officer first class named Saburo Sakai gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi Zero at Iwo Jima airfield, perched on islands born from volcanic fury. The runway itself seemed to shimmer and dance in the oppressive morning heat. His hands, steady despite what lay ahead, had already sent more enemy aircraft spinning toward the Earth than most pilots would encounter in their entire careers. Looking through his canopy toward the eastern horizon, Sakai knew what was coming. American carrier planes would arrive soon, but not in the orderly formations he remembered from 1941. What was approaching now moved like a swarm, darkening the sky the way thunderstorms blot out the sun. Every week brought these assaults. Every single week they came by the dozens, sometimes by hundreds. Just moments before he'd strapped into his aircraft, Sakai had spoken these words to a fellow pilot. They would become the final statement on the fate of Japanese naval aviation, an epitaph written in prophecy. With 28 confirmed victories recorded to his name, Sakai stood among Japan's most accomplished aerial combatants. Yet what he grasped with painful clarity was something the younger men around him could not yet comprehend. They were witnessing the inevitable march toward defeat, and it wasn't being written in tactical doctrine or battle strategy. It was being written in factory production numbers, in statistics that rendered individual courage and skill almost meaningless. Far to the east, 600 miles across the Pacific, Task Force 58 was launching its morning strike. 15 fleet carriers were releasing 450 aircraft in perfectly synchronized waves, each one heading west toward Japanese positions. The week before, the Americans had lost 89 planes. This morning, they were throwing 5 times that number into the sky without hesitation or fear of loss. In the ready rooms aboard the USS Essex, USS Yorktown, and USS Lexington, young ensigns barely out of training school were preparing for their first actual combat operations. These men had logged only 400 hours in the air. Behind them, though they didn't know it yet, were assembly lines churning out 3 brand new Hellcats for every single one that got shot down. The mathematics of destruction had already been determined. America would manufacture 96,318 aircraft during 1944 alone. That exceeded the total number of planes Japan had built throughout its entire history. The path to this impossible moment had begun 16 years before, during the humid depths of summer 1928, when a teenaged Saburo Sakai stood looking at the gates of Sasebeo Naval Base. He'd been born on August 25, 1916, in Saga Prefecture. The third of 8 children born into a family of farmers scraping by on meager harvests and accumulated debt. His ancestors had once been samurai, but those days lay generations behind. At age 16, Sakai made his choice. He enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy, seeking anything that might provide escape from rural poverty, where nothing but rice paddies and financial ruin seemed to stretch endlessly into the future. The process for selecting naval aviators had been designed to be brutally selective. When Sakai's class entered Tsuchiura Naval Aviation School in 1937, 1,500 young men walked through those doors hoping to earn wings. Exactly 70 would succeed. The washout rate exceeded 95%, and this was entirely intentional. The Navy wanted elite pilots, not merely adequate ones. They would accept nothing less. The training was designed to break the weak and harden the strong. Candidates hung from iron bars until their hands split open and bled. They swam through January seas until their bodies began shutting down from cold. They flew aerobatics until they emptied their stomachs, then flew more. Some men simply couldn't endure it. Sakai graduated 11th in his class on November 27, 1937. He carried with him 650 hours of flight experience, a number that would seem almost miraculous when compared to American training programs just 5 years down the road. The Navy assigned him to the 12th Kokutai Air Group. His first taste of actual combat came over China between 1938 and 1939, where he flew a Mitsubishi A5M against Chinese pilots in antiquated biplanes that barely seemed capable of staying airborne. His first kill came on October 5, 1938, near Hankow. A Soviet-built Polikarpov I-16 fighter, its engine already struggling against his superior aircraft, burned and fell from the sky after just 2 seconds of gunfire from his machine guns. By May 1941, when Sakai joined the elite Tainan Kokutai based on Formosa, he'd accumulated more than 800 hours of flight time and 4 confirmed victories to his name. The Tainan Air Group represented the very pinnacle of Japanese naval aviation. The pilots flying there would later become legendary figures in aviation history. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa would claim 87 victories before his eventual death. Toshio Ota would achieve 34 kills. Masaki Shimakawa would reach 27. These men viewed themselves as inheritors of samurai tradition, aerial warriors whose skill and spirit would surely overcome any material disadvantage the enemy possessed. They believed this with absolute conviction. The first harsh indication of what they would actually face arrived on December 8, 1941, December 7th across the dateline, when Sakai participated in the assault on Clark Field in the Philippines. Flying escort alongside 54 twin-engine G4M bombers, the Zero fighters found the Americans completely off guard, despite having received 9 hours of warning following the Pearl Harbor attack. Sakai shot down a P-40 Warhawk, watching the American fighter come apart under his cannon fire. Below on the ground, orderly rows of B-17 flying fortresses erupted into flames, burning so intensely that the scene resembled a vast forest fire consuming everything in its path. What seized Sakai's attention most powerfully wasn't the simplicity of victory, but something far more unsettling. Over 100 American aircraft had been destroyed in a single morning. If the Americans could afford to leave so many planes sitting exposed and vulnerable, even after receiving hours of warning that war had begun, what kind of reserves did they actually have? What factories lay behind those numbers? The opening months of 1942 seemed to answer these questions favorably for Japan. On February 3rd, flying from the newly seized base at Rabaul, Sakai engaged American Wildcats above Bougainville, and the Zero's superior turning ability became obvious. The American fighters simply could not maneuver the way his aircraft could. During these days, which seemed almost golden by comparison to what would follow, the kill ratios appeared to validate everything Japan's pilot training philosophy had claimed. At the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27th, Sakai's squadron destroyed multiple enemy aircraft while suffering only minimal losses. Over Darwin on February 19th, the Tainan Kokutai claimed numerous victories against negligible casualties. Individual Japanese pilots were regularly downing multiple opponents in single engagements. Yet disturbing patterns were beginning to emerge for those with eyes to see them. When Sakai shot down a B-17 in early 1942, he watched in amazement as the bomber absorbed tremendous punishment before finally falling. Its gunners had maintained accurate fire throughout, continuing to shoot even as flames consumed the fuselage. More troubling still was what happened next. When American squadrons lost aircraft, replacements arrived within days. When the Japanese lost fighters, it took weeks for replacements to arrive from Japan by transport. The arithmetic was stark and simple, yet virtually no one acted on what it meant. The Allies were replacing their losses faster than Japan could inflict damage. This was the brutal equation. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, operations officer for the Tainan Kokutai, worked through the mathematics privately, calculating that Japan would need to achieve a kill ratio of 10-1 just to maintain balance by 1944. The actual ratio was running about 3-1 at best. The gap was widening. August 7, 1942, at 05:30 hours, the alarm blared across Lakunai airfield at Rabaul. American forces had invaded Guadalcanal and Tulagi, and the Japanese had received no warning. Sakai rushed to his Zero, one of 18 fighters assigned to escort 27 G4M bombers on the grueling 560 nautical mile journey to Guadalcanal. This would be the longest fighter mission ever attempted to that point. The flight pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. For 4 hours, Sakai maintained formation above the Solomon Sea, managing his fuel with absolute precision. The slightest excess throttle, the smallest unnecessary maneuver, could mean ditching in shark-infested waters on the return journey. Behind him, rookie pilots fresh out of flight school just weeks earlier struggled to hold position, their fuel gauges dropping faster than their calculations had predicted. At 13:15 hours, Guadalcanal appeared below them, and what they saw defied belief. The ocean seemed covered with warships spreading across the horizon. Sakai would later write in his autobiography, Samurai, published in 1957, describing how he counted over 70 vessels, including what looked to be 6 aircraft carriers. In reality, 82 Allied ships were present, including 3 fleet carriers, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, that were launching continuous fighter patrols. The battle that unfolded would echo through aviation history. Sakai shot down a dauntless dive bomber, then found himself locked in prolonged combat with Lieutenant James Pug Sutherland, whose Wildcat flew with VF-5 off the Saratoga. For nearly 20 minutes, the two fighters twisted through the sky in classic dogfight fashion, each pilot forcing his aircraft to the absolute edge of its capabilities. Sutherland, a veteran with over 500 combat hours behind him, matched Sakai maneuver for maneuver until his ammunition ran dry and he had no choice but to break off. But the day's turning point came at 14:50, when Sakai spotted what he believed were 8 Wildcat fighters flying loose below him at 8,000 feet. He rolled into a diving attack from their blind spot, closing to just 50 meters before realizing his terrible mistake. They weren't fighters at all. They were SBD Dauntless dive bombers, each carrying a rear gunner. Aviation machinist's mate Second Class Harold Lew Jones manned the twin .30 caliber Browning machine guns in Lieutenant Dudley Adams' Dauntless. As Sakai closed in, Jones opened fire with devastating precision. The bullets found their mark. One round penetrated Sakai's skull just above his right eye, destroying the eye completely and instantly. Another creased the side of his skull, causing partial paralysis down his left side. Blood poured into his remaining eye, effectively blinding him. What happened next stands as one of the most remarkable achievements in aviation history. Semi-conscious, partially paralyzed, and unable to see, Sakai flew 560 nautical miles back to Rabaul, using volcanic smoke plumes rising from distant islands as his only navigation aid. For 4 hours and 47 minutes, he drifted between consciousness and delirium, multiple times nearly flipping his aircraft into the ocean. He landed at Rabaul at 1800 hours with less than 10 liters of fuel remaining in his tanks. The mission statistics revealed the true story. Japan lost 23 aircraft and their crews. America lost fewer planes and rescued most of its downed pilots. While Japan struggled to replace 24 aircraft, American carriers were already receiving replacement planes flown directly from factories on the West Coast. While Sakai lay recovering in naval hospitals during a process that would consume 8 months, the air war over Guadalcanal ground through Japanese naval aviation like a relentless machine. The numbers from those months tell a terrible story. Between August 1942 and February 1943, the Japanese Navy lost nearly 900 aircraft across the Solomon Islands. Behind each aircraft flew a pilot with a minimum of 500 flight hours, many with 1,000 or more. These men represented years of training investment Japan simply could not replace or rebuild. The pilot training schools were graduating only 100 pilots each month, and each successive class received progressively fewer training hours, down to 400 hours by early 1943. The Americans graduated 2,500 naval aviators monthly from Pensacola alone, with thousands more coming from Corpus Christi, Jacksonville, and San Diego. Each American pilot logged a minimum of 400 flight hours, including 100 hours in actual combat aircraft types. When they arrived in the combat zone, experienced pilots took them under their wing, mentoring them through their first dangerous missions. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant mind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, visited Guadalcanal in October 1942 and was horrified by what he found. In a report stamped Most Secret and delivered personally to Admiral Yamamoto, he wrote that Japan was literally wearing away its naval aviation strength in a war of attrition it could not possibly win. The enemy replaced every loss immediately. Japan could not replace them at all. The Japanese tried to adapt through tactical innovation. They extended operations from Rabaul by establishing forward bases. They coordinated massive fighter sweeps. They developed new tactics. None of it mattered against the overwhelming tide of numbers. The production gap was simply too vast. In 1940, before entering the war, America produced 12,804 military aircraft. Japan, already 3 years into its China campaign, managed only 4,968. American production was essentially at peacetime levels. Japan was already manufacturing at maximum capacity. Pearl Harbor changed American industry overnight. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan, which didn't exist in 1940, was producing one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes by 1944. The single factory floor exceeded the total space of all Japanese aircraft manufacturing combined. At maximum production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 150,000 individual parts. North American Aviation manufactured over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs, each superior to the Zero in speed, firepower, armor, and high-altitude performance. Grumman built 12,275 F-6F Hellcats in just 30 months, a fighter specifically designed to defeat the Zero. This single aircraft would shoot down more Japanese planes than any other fighter in history, and it was produced at rates exceeding a dozen per day. The disparity extended beyond raw numbers to technological advancement. While Japan struggled to maintain production of the increasingly obsolete Zero, America introduced entirely new aircraft types every quarter. The F-4U Corsair could outrun the Zero by 80 miles per hour. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning, with its devastating firepower, could attack from altitudes where the Zero's engines gasped for breath. By mid-1943, American aircraft engines produced 2,000 horsepower compared to the Zero's 130. American fighters carried armor plating to protect their pilots. The Zero had none. American planes burned high-octane fuel that provided significantly more power than Japan's aviation gasoline. Every advantage belonged to America. Sakai returned to limited duty in June 1943 with his right eye permanently destroyed and his depth perception compromised. Posted to Toyohashi Air Base as an instructor, he witnessed firsthand the collapse of Japanese pilot training standards. New students arriving from primary training had logged only 150 flight hours, less than American pilots received before ever touching a combat aircraft. In a 1985 interview, Sakai reflected on the impossible task before him. "We were supposed to transform these children into fighter pilots in 3 months," he said. "The system was collapsing and everyone could see it." The aircraft barely made it to the runway without disaster. They weren't training new pilots anymore, they were sending boys to their deaths, nothing more than that. The very planes themselves showed just how desperate Japan's situation had become. These advanced training fighters were exhausted relics from the China War, held together with countless patches and repairs until they were barely airworthy. The fuel situation was so tight that each student got only 60 hours aloft during operational training. When something broke, there was nothing to replace it. Damaged trainers didn't get repaired, they got torn apart. The good bits were stripped off and used to keep other aircraft flying. The men teaching these students were mostly wounded veterans, men like Sakai who should have been sent home to recover. But Japan couldn't afford to lose them. These broken men, their bodies scarred and damaged, tried to teach young pilots knowledge they'd never live long enough to actually use in combat. By late 1943, the numbers told a horrifying story. Most of the graduates from that year's training classes were dead within 6 months of reaching their combat assignments. Even with injuries that should have kept him grounded, Sakai decided to volunteer for combat duty again in June 1944. The American invasion of the Mariana Islands had brought B-29 bombers within striking distance of Japan itself. The military needed every pilot they could find, including half-blind veterans who belonged in hospital beds. Sakai shipped out to Yokosuka Kokutai and arrived at Iwo Jima on June 24, 1944. He stepped off that transport into what Americans would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a disaster that had already claimed enormous losses. A single day earlier, on June 19th, Japanese naval aviation had lost 315 aircraft, along with 445 more. The Americans lost just 29 planes. They recovered most of their pilots too. When Sakai flew his first combat mission from Iwo Jima that same day, he came face to face with the crushing reality of American air power. Leading a section of 4 Zeros to intercept incoming aircraft, he expected the manageable fighter formations he'd known in 1942. Instead, he faced an overwhelming strike force, over 200 American planes in perfectly coordinated waves, organized by type. The sky was utterly black with them, he would tell historians decades later in 1994. They came in layers, fighters covering the top, dive bombers in the middle, torpedo planes below. For every enemy he engaged, 5 more appeared from nowhere. During that fight, Sakai found himself completely isolated, facing off against 15 F-6F Hellcats. Every technique he'd learned through years of flying barely kept him alive. The engagement stretched 20 minutes, an eternity in air combat. He dove into clouds to break visual contact, pulled up into snap rolls that pushed the aircraft to the very edge of structural failure. At one point, he dove so low toward the ocean that seawater spray covered his entire canopy. He might have damaged one Hellcat. Maybe. But deep down, he knew it meant nothing. The Americans lost dozens of aircraft, and it barely registered to them. The battle's mathematics were terrifyingly simple. Japan sent 450 aircraft to the Marianas and lost 480 planes, including reinforcements, in just 3 days. Task Force 58 flew nearly 1,000 sorties on June 19th alone, losing only 29 aircraft while destroying roughly 2/3 of all Japanese naval aviation in a single afternoon. By October 1944, when Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi officially established the Special Attack Units at Mabalacat in the Philippines, calling them kamikaze, the decision wasn't driven by fanaticism. It reflected something far colder: mathematical necessity. Sakai grasped this brutal logic completely. Years later, in a 1998 interview, Sakai laid it out plainly. The reality was that boys with just 30 hours of flight training were fighting against Americans with 300 hours. These young pilots couldn't even locate the enemy, let alone shoot them down. If they flew normally, they'd die without accomplishing anything at all. But if they flew as kamikaze, they might at least damage a ship. The arithmetic was straightforward. The whole training system had collapsed into ruin. The Yokoren Naval Aviator Preparatory Course was rushing students through in 90 days with fewer than 100 total flight hours. Many had never even fired their weapons in the air. Ammunition was too scarce to waste on gunnery practice. Navigation beyond visual range was impossible for most. Dogfighting skills simply didn't exist. The American response was absolutely overwhelming. Task Force 38 could put up 1,200 aircraft from its 17 fleet carriers plus another 8 light carriers. These forces got constantly replenished. Whenever air groups took heavy losses, they rotated back home and fresh squadrons replaced them. The Japanese did things differently. Units fought until they were completely wiped out. Sakai's final combat missions came in 1945 during Japan's desperate defense of its own soil. From Yokosuka Naval Air Station near Tokyo, he scrambled to intercept B-29 raids and later faced off against carrier aircraft. What unfolded defied comprehension. During Operation Ten-Go, Japan's defense of Okinawa in April 1945, thousands of kamikaze attacks threw themselves at the American invasion fleet. But by that point, the Americans had refined their defensive systems into a machine of devastating efficiency. Radar-directed 5-inch guns opened fire at 10,000 yards, tearing aircraft apart before they got close. 40mm Bofors guns engaged at 4,000 yards, creating a secondary wall of destruction. 20mm Oerlikon cannons formed a final barrier at just 2,000 yards. New proximity-fused shells detonated automatically as planes passed nearby. Combat air patrols of 50 or more Hellcats, vectored by radar, intercepted incoming formations 50 miles from the fleet. We'd start with 100 aircraft, Sakai remembered. By the time we reached the American ships, maybe 20 were still flying. Of those 20, perhaps 1 or 2 managed to actually strike a ship, usually a destroyer on radar picket duty. And the Americans had so many ships that losing a destroyer barely mattered to them. The statistics from Okinawa are almost incomprehensible in scale. Japan flew 1,465 kamikaze sorties and lost over 1,000 additional aircraft in regular combat. They sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 more. Yet Task Force 58 stayed fully operational throughout, flying 40,000 combat sorties. The exchange rate was brutal. For every American ship sunk, Japan lost 60 aircraft and the pilots who flew them. Sakai's last mission came in early August 1945, just days before Japan surrendered. Leading Zeros from Yokosuka to intercept B-32 Dominator reconnaissance bombers photographing Tokyo, he participated in a mission that perfectly captured the war's utter futility. Obsolete fighters against America's newest bomber, itself a backup design because America could afford redundancy in everything. The intercept failed. The B-32s flew too high and too fast for the Zeros to catch. Sakai could only watch helplessly as they photographed Japanese cities that had already been reduced to smoking rubble. The war had already ended. These missions were simply documenting what remained. The production figures told Japan's complete story of aerial defeat. The United States built 295,959 aircraft during the war, including 99,465 fighters. Japan built 76,320 aircraft total, including 30,447 fighters. America produced more aircraft in 1944 alone, 96,318 planes, than Japan manufactured during the entire war. American fighter production by itself exceeded Japan's total aircraft production of every type combined. Yet numbers only told part of the story. By 1945, American aircraft were technological generations beyond their 1941 versions. The P-51D Mustang reached 437 mph, compared to the Zero's 331 mph. The F-4U-4 Corsair climbed at 4,500 feet per minute, while the Zero managed just 3,100. Japanese aircraft development stalled completely. The A6M50 that Sakai flew in 1944 barely differed from the A6M2 of 1941, slightly faster perhaps, but still unarmored, still mounting the same cannons, still hamstrung by that underpowered engine. Behind each aircraft sat a pilot, and here too the numbers were impossibly tilted against Japan. America trained 193,440 pilots during World War II, including 60,956 naval aviators. Japan trained roughly 15,000 naval aviators and 25,000 Army pilots total. American pilot training maintained consistent quality throughout the war, requiring over 400 hours before combat. Japanese training progressively collapsed, dropping from 700 to 800 hours in 1941 down to just 50 to 100 hours by 1942-1945. By war's end, American replacement pilots arrived with more flight time than many Japanese flight instructors possessed. Other top Japanese aces confirmed exactly what Sakai observed about American numbers. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's leading ace with 87 victories, spoke with Sakai during his final leave in October 1944. "It's completely different now, Saburo," Nishizawa said. "Back in 1942, I could fly alone and attack an entire squadron. Now they come at us in groups of 50, 100, 200. There's no room to turn, nowhere to escape. We're simply drowning in numbers." Nishizawa died just days later on October 26, 1944. Not shot down in combat, but killed as a passenger in a transport plane intercepted by Hellcats. His death perfectly embodied the late-war reality. Japan's greatest ace died unable even to defend himself. Commander Masatake Okamiya, who later wrote the definitive book Zero with designer Jiro Horikoshi, provided the most clinical post-war analysis. "We believed Spirit could overcome material shortcomings. We thought one Japanese pilot was worth 3 Americans. Perhaps that was true in 1941. By 1943, the Americans had superior aircraft. By 1944, they had better trained pilots. By 1945, they possessed such overwhelming numbers that individual quality became completely irrelevant." Tetsuzo Iwamoto, among the few top aces who actually survived the war, reflected on the grinding futility. "I shot down a Hellcat in the morning. That afternoon, 3 more appeared. I got one of those. The next morning, 10 showed up. How do you even fight that? You don't. You survive as long as you possibly can." One moment from Sakai's combat history revealed the human dimension often buried beneath production statistics and kill counts. On February 9, 1942, while strafing an airfield in Java, Sakai spotted what looked like a military transport and dove to attack. As he closed in, he saw something through the windows that stopped him cold. Women and children, Dutch civilians, desperately evacuating from the collapsing Netherlands East Indies. "I couldn't pull the trigger," Sakai recalled years afterward. "These weren't soldiers. They were mothers and children running for their lives. I pulled up and wagged my wings, signaling them to go. The Dutch pilot saw the gesture and waved back. Sakai's wingmen, following his lead, also held their fire. That transport reached Australia safely, carrying people who would certainly have died otherwise. This single moment of mercy revealed the complex humanity existing within the machinery of war. 40 years later, at an aviation gathering in the United States, a Dutch woman approached Sakai with tears streaming down her face. She had been that child aboard the transport. Her survival and that of her own children and grandchildren traced directly back to one Japanese pilot's split-second choice to see human beings instead of targets. In his final years, Sakai grew increasingly critical of the romantic mythology surrounding Japanese warriors and kamikaze pilots. When he stood before audiences at American military academies and aviation museums, Saburo Sakai shattered every romantic myth about dying for emperor and country. His words cut through decades of propaganda with surgical precision. "You want to know what was going through their minds?" he would ask, addressing a room full of naval officers in 1991. "When those kamikaze pilots were diving toward your ships, what do you think they were thinking about? Not the emperor, not honor, their mothers. That's what I heard in their last radio transmissions. Oka-san, Oka-san, mother, mother, over and over. They were just boys, terrified boys, not the fanatics history claimed they were." He approached the Bushido Code with the same unsparing honesty. That code? It was propaganda, pure and simple. A tool for convincing young men to throw their lives away. The historical samurai were nothing like the myth. They fought when circumstances favored them and withdrew when they didn't. They understood strategy. They weren't suicidal. We were the suicidal ones. We fought against basic mathematics and acted shocked when we lost. His most provocative moment came during a joint appearance with Paul Tibbets, who had piloted the Enola Gay. If Japan had developed the atomic bomb first and received orders to drop it on Los Angeles, I would have obeyed without hesitation. That's the nature of war. America was simply more efficient at waging it than we were. Speaking in 1998, Sakai expressed deep frustration with Japanese military leadership. People constantly asked him why Japan continued fighting when victory had become impossible. The answer was complicated and troubling. The young pilots, those frightened boys dying in their aircraft, believed every word of the propaganda. In their minds, Japan was winning, right up until the very end. Only the senior officers possessed the actual truth, and they chose the samurai path of death rather than the disgrace of surrender. The military leadership that initiated the war understood American power firsthand. They had traveled there. They had walked through American factories, witnessed the industrial capacity, observed the technological advantages, yet they convinced themselves that Japanese spiritual superiority could overcome material reality. They sent young pilots to their deaths, defending an illusion. When discussion turned to his personal combat record, Sakai remained refreshingly candid about the gulf between official accounts and what had actually been recorded. American audiences believed he had achieved 64 victories, a figure his ghostwriter Martin Kaiden had created for publication. Sakai corrected this repeatedly. The verified record showed 28 aerial victories, with some of those shared among pilots. In warfare, exaggeration happens everywhere. What truly matters isn't the exact count, he insisted, but that someone survived to tell the world the reality of war. The decades following 1945 brought something few could have predicted: genuine reconciliation between former combatants. In May 1982, historian Henry Sakai arranged an extraordinary meeting at the Nimitz Museum between Sakai and Harold Lew Jones, the gunner whose bullets had destroyed one of Sakai's eyes and nearly ended his life during the fighting at Guadalcanal. Such a moment could easily have turned bitter or hostile. Instead, something remarkable unfolded. Sakai arrived carrying his flight helmet, its surface still scarred with entry holes from Jones's machine gun fire, the fabric stained with blood from 40 years before. When Jones took the helmet into his trembling hands, the weight of it seemed to settle upon him in a new way. For the first time, he grasped the human reality of those bullets he had fired so long ago. "I was simply doing my duty," Jones said quietly. "I never considered the person in that cockpit." "You were serving your country exactly as I was serving mine," Sakai replied. "We were both young men doing what we believed was required. There is nothing to forgive here, only respect." The two men became genuine friends, exchanging letters through the years until Jones passed away in 2009. Before that final parting, Sakai presented Jones with the blood-stained helmet, telling him it belonged with the man whose marksmanship had ended his career as a pilot. In his post-war years, Sakai became determined to help Japanese citizens understand something crucial. American triumph hadn't resulted from greater courage or superior piloting skill. Both sides had demonstrated tremendous bravery and ability. Victory flowed instead from systematic advantages in manufacturing, organization, and pilot preparation. The American pilot training pipeline exemplified this approach perfectly. By 1943, the United States Navy had established a factory-like system for producing trained aviators. This system maintained consistent excellence while achieving enormous output. Pilots completed a 60-week program and accumulated a minimum of 400 flight hours before entering combat. Japan's system, meanwhile, was crumbling by 1945, pushing pilots into battle with fewer than 100 hours of experience. Sakai's observation about American aircraft arriving in endless waves reflected a mathematical reality that defied resistance. During major campaigns, American naval forces could project aircraft in overwhelming numbers in continuous waves. Take June 19, 1944, at the Philippine Sea. Japan launched 373 aircraft across 4 separate attacks. America launched 956 sorties from 15 carriers in response. The tally was brutal: 315 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 29 American aircraft lost. The Americans had achieved what military strategists call numerical dominance, a form of superiority so complete that individual skill becomes almost irrelevant to the outcome. When each Japanese pilot encountered 5, 10, possibly 15 opponents, individual excellence ceased to matter. No technique could overcome those odds. Sakai spent his remaining years working to mend relations between societies that had been enemies. He encouraged his daughter to attend university in America, telling her to master English, understand democracy, comprehend the factors that had enabled American victory. She eventually married an American military officer, a union that symbolized the healing between former antagonists. At aviation exhibitions and veteran gatherings, Sakai stood alongside American pilots, signing photographs and recounting specific aerial engagements. Former adversaries who had once attempted each other's deaths now shared laughter like brothers who had flown together for years. His message to young Japanese remained unwavering. We lost because we accepted our own propaganda as truth. We imagined that willpower and spirit could overcome physical reality. America prevailed because they worked with mathematics, not mythology. How many aircraft could be built? How many pilots must be trained? How much fuel was required? They calculated, we dreamed. To American listeners, he offered a different perspective. Your victory emerged from industrial production, yes, but that production originated from something deeper. Free citizens working in free factories produced more than enslaved workers in controlled shops ever could. Your strength came not merely from numerical advantage, but from the system generating those numbers. The mechanism of freedom itself proved superior to the machine of tyranny. The historical record of the Pacific Air War reveals the mathematical trap Japan had stepped into. During wartime construction, America built 28 fleet carriers and 71 escort carriers. Japan built 6 fleet carriers and 4 escort carriers. For naval aviators trained during the conflict, America graduated approximately 60,000. Japan trained roughly 15,000. Aviation fuel capacity in 1944. America produced 6.5 billion gallons. Japan produced 315 million gallons. Every statistic whispered the identical conclusion. America could suffer 10 losses for every Japanese plane destroyed and still maintain dominance through sheer volume. In reality, the Americans achieved even more favorable mathematics, downing multiple Japanese aircraft for each one they lost. The outcome was sealed before the final shots were fired. On September 22, 2000, Saburo Sakai stood among American naval officers in the Officers' Club at Atsugi Naval Air Station, attending a formal dinner as an honored guest of the United States Navy. At 84 years old, his mind remained sharp, his bearing dignified. He occupied a seat between American naval officers, recounting stories of dogfights and the journey from warfare to friendship. As the evening progressed, he reflected on his transformation. I devoted my youth to killing Americans. My old age has been spent becoming their friend. The latter endeavor has brought me far greater satisfaction than the former. When a young American aviator, a lieutenant commander named William Johnson, rose to offer thanks for Sakai's attendance, Sakai reached across the table to return the handshake. His body suddenly went rigid. The greeting was completed, but then Sakai's form collapsed backward. A massive cardiac event seized him. He departed in an ambulance bound for the naval hospital, his consciousness fading. His final gesture had been extended toward an American officer in the spirit of friendship. The symbolism struck everyone in the room with overwhelming force. The warrior who had spent his fighting years attempting to destroy Americans had breathed his last while reaching out to one in peace. Sakai's insight about American aircraft appearing in endless numbers, despite Japanese pilots shooting them down constantly, illuminates the fundamental nature of industrial conflict. Heroic deeds, brilliant tactics, warrior spirit. These things mean little when confronted with overwhelming material power systematically deployed. The arithmetic tells the complete story. America manufactured 3.87 times more aircraft. America trained 4.83 times more pilots. America produced 20.6 times more aviation fuel. America constructed 9.9 times more aircraft carriers. And somehow America still managed a favorable kill ratio despite fielding greater numbers. Sakai's deepest wisdom lay in grasping why these numbers existed in the first place. 3 months before he died, during his final recorded interview, he reflected, "America won because it was a free society mobilizing for all-out war. Free workers constructed aircraft faster than forced laborers working in our facilities. Free scientists created superior technology compared to our regimented research institutions. Free pilots improvised and adapted more effectively than our indoctrinated fighters. Those planes coming in continuous waves weren't merely metal and engineering. They represented the tangible output of freedom itself." He stopped, letting that thought settle. We believed we were fighting for our divine emperor. They understood they were fighting for their future. That comprehension allowed them to manufacture those endless planes, prepare those masses of pilots, sustain those countless operations. They were defending something genuinely worth defending. Sakai's ultimate message transcends the numbers themselves. It concerns the structures that generate those numbers. Japanese military command had faith in quality through spiritual refinement, a handful of exceptional warriors conquering larger numbers of inferior opponents. America trusted in quantity through systematic production, overwhelming force, scientifically calibrated. The samurai met the assembly line, and the assembly line prevailed. Not because Americans possessed greater courage or skill. Sakai demonstrated throughout his life that Japanese aviators could rival anyone in bravery and ability. The assembly line defeated the samurai because it replaced destruction faster than the samurai could inflict it, absorbed lessons faster than enemies could profit from them, and transformed faster than tradition-bound cultures could adapt. When Sakai said we shot them down constantly, but they appeared by dozens, he spoke of more than air combat. He witnessed the ending of warrior culture and the emergence of mechanized warfare, where victory belonged not to the best, but to the most. Within that cruel arithmetic, Japan possessed no path forward. Saburo Sakai, pilot, survivor, and ultimately bridge builder, became history's witness to this transformation. his personal arc from attacking American aircraft to grasping the hand of American pilots mirrors Japan's larger journey. From imperialist militarism to democratic partnership, from warrior civilization to technological economy, from fortress isolation to global cooperation. The American planes he faced in combat eventually helped him understand why peace mattered more than victory. That handshake at Atsugi, completed in the moment his life departed, represented a peace treaty written across the Pacific sky by young warriors who gave everything, only to discover that everything could not overcome mathematics itself. The dozens kept coming, and in the end, the dozens always prevailed.